Hello, everybody. Welcome to Unit 3, Day 1. Today we are going to be discussing, first of all, we're going to be jumping into Unit 3, but also we are going to be discussing the French and Indian War. And the French and Indian War you're going to see is a very pivotal war because it is really going to be the war that paves the way for the later American Revolution. After the French and Indian War, you're going to see the British are going to get a lot more involved in North America in with the colonies, and that's going to be what is going to lead to the American Revolution. So starting out here, one thing you need to realize is that during this time, the three major empires, Great Britain, France, and Spain, all in the 17th century, all went out or get involved in wars with each other and with other countries during this time as well. But those three major powers were pretty much constantly involved in some sort of war, either in Europe, in Europe, India, North America, and different places like that. And that would have a big impact on colonial policy during this time. One of the things you're going to see is that the British, actually you saw this in the last unit too, that the British would not allow the colonists to trade or use ships from other countries. And one reason for that is because the French were their enemies. And you're going to see that the British would implement that same kind of policy involving other countries as well. I've listed there some wars there, King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and King George's War. All of these wars were fought over territory and power, and all had an influence on territory on the colonies. A lot of times you see after a war an adjustment in the territory and the colonies and what exactly that would look like. As I have said before, this was known as the 7 Years' War around the rest of the world. Here in the United States or in the colonies, it was known as the French and Indian War. And no, it wasn't the French and the Indians fighting against each other. It was the French and the Indians teaming up to fight against the British. So another thing with this that you have to consider is that the Indian groups here were also aligning with and shifting their alliances based on whatever sides were fighting within the wars during this time. And so you're going to see the natives will take sides in this, just like they do with the French and Indian War. They decide to side with the French in this. I asked the question on there, what examples can you think of where they would shift their alliances and who they would align with? And one of those is the Iroquois and the fur trade. You're going to see the Iroquois would change their alliances several different times, eventually siding with the French. And this would matter because, again, the natives are going to take sides in this struggle. There's a video here for you to watch from YouTube that explains in detail a little bit more about the French and Indian War. You can check that out on your own time. So what are going to be the issues that lead to the French and Indian War? One of the things you're going to have is conflict over land west of the Appalachian Mountains. If you look there on the map, you can see the area that is in blue and red there together, that is disputed territory between the French and the English during this time. One of the things that happens is that the Ohio Company of Virginia would give a land grant to the Virginia colonists to be able to settle the Ohio River Valley. Well, the Ohio River Valley during this time was area that the French claimed, so obviously that is going to lead to conflict. And within that disputed area, you're actually going to have French military forts. One of the earliest conflicts to happen as part of the 7 Years' War here in the colonies would be George Washington and his men are sent over, a group of them from Virginia, to seize French military forts in the Ohio River Valley. Now, George Washington, he would not have success in this. Actually, him and all of his men would be captured, and they would eventually be returned by the French to the Virginia colonies. But this is really going to be the thing that pushes and gets the British and colonists really clamoring for war between the two sides, is because of this and because of George Washington and his people retreated, again, when this was disputed areas between the two sides. Next up, you're going to see resentment over basically what had happened is that they had these payoff systems with the Indians, and what they were doing is paying them off not to attack them, basically to have peace with both sides. They would do this. Well, there was a lot of resentment over this, and this system would break down, especially with the British. Now, the system worked better with the French because the French were not fighting against it completely all the time. in the same way that the British was. You're going to actually see that the Board of Trade, the British Board of Trade, would try to get the Iroquois to side with them against New France in order to try to repair the relationship. But at this point, because of the breakdown in the system, it just wouldn't work out. Plus, as we've talked about before, the French had just a lot better relationship with the natives than the British did. So in 1754, you'd have the meeting of the Albany Plan of Union. And in this, this is an important event because, again, this is going to be one of these early times that you see the colonies actually trying to work together. And this would kind of set the precedent for later the colonies working together. Now, this whole thing had been headed up by Ben Franklin. And you had 7 of the 13 colonies meet together and discuss what they can do. And again, this wasn't a focus on independence. This was a focus on how to deal with the Indians and how to provide defense against the French during this time. So Ben Franklin suggests this plan of union, that the colonies would work together. And you can see there, he says, under one government as far as might be necessary for defense and other general purposes. Now, this plan would be rejected by colonial assemblies who were worried about the taxing powers of the colonies and what this union would look like. And again, you're going to see that this plan of union, some of the issues that they raise with that are going to be issues that we're going to have later on in the early creation of the United States. But the reason that this is so important is because this would set the precedent for later colonial assemblies that would meet together for the American Revolution. So what were the results of the French and Indian War? We don't actually talk about the specifics of the war itself, but you're going to see that this war ends up being France, Spain, and Austria versus Britain and Prussia. And the British goal in this is to crush the French, and that way that they can have expansion. The war would end with the Treaty of Paris. You're going to see that the British are going to be very, very successful with this. They would be given sovereignty over half of North America, and the French are going to be effectively just pushed out of the colonies altogether. You can see that on the map there. Now, they would retain some people within France, but as far as a large scale, having military here and all that, they are going to be pushed out of North America. So this would be, again, a huge victory for the British. Now, this is going to be a victory that is going to cost them in the end. So what effects did the war have on British? Well, first, they were now unchallenged in their supremacy in North America, and they were the world's dominant military naval power during this time. Another thing that is going to happen, another effect, is that you're going to see that during the French and Indian War, you're going to see that this is the first time that a lot of colonists had interacted with British people on a very large scale. And the British didn't really care that much for the American militia that came to fight with them. They saw them as very poorly trained and as disorderly rabble. They didn't really like them very much. They were also upset that some colonies just refused to send troops to help fight in that. And the British saw this. They said, from basically the way that they viewed the colonists, they said, hey, we don't think the colonists are able to defend themselves, and we don't think they're actually even willing to defend themselves. So you're going to see that the British have a very low opinion of the colonists that they encounter here. Now, as for the colonists, you're going to see that the colonists saw this, again, as an attempt, what effect would the war have on them? They saw this as a time for them to get to work with the British, which they hadn't got to during that time. And they thought that they had done really, really well, and they didn't like the British attitudes towards them. And there's numerous writings about how the colonists felt about the British after this, and they felt like the British looked down on them and didn't treat them well and basically treated them as second-class citizens. They also were not very happy with the British troops and their style of war. One thing you got to remember is that the colonists had been over here at this point for almost 150 years and had been involved in a lot of guerrilla-type warfare with the natives. So they didn't like the British methods of war and didn't feel like that it was very well suited for America. And when we get to the American Revolution, you're going to actually see that the colonists would use some of those guerrilla warfare tactics against the British. The colonists also hoped that with the victory in the war, they were very happy about it, thinking, hey, we're going to get to move into these new lands that the British have acquired west of the Appalachian Mountains, the Ohio River Valley, and those different areas. So There is an article for you to read today called The First World War that's going to talk about why this war should be considered the actual First World War than the one that happened later on in American history. So another thing that happens during the war that is famously shown in the movie The Last of the Mohicans is going to be the Fort William Henry massacre. And you're going to see with this massacre that British forces at the fort had surrendered because they were outmanned by the French and the Indians that were there. The terms of the surrender with this was that the British camp and followers would be allowed to withdraw. They would have a French escort. The British soldiers promised not to fight for 18 months. They were allowed to keep guns and cannon, but they couldn't keep any bullets with that. And the French Indian allies were told about this agreement. Now, with this, you're going to see that this would be a massacre that would happen. Basically, once the British troops get outside of there, the natives or the Indians would come around and kill many of those ones. And this is probably the most infamous incident to happen during the French and Indian War towards the British and the colonists during this time. But again, if you ever see the movie The Last of the Mohicans, they show, portray this event happening during the war. So, all right, so the big thing with the French and Indian War is that it's going to lead to a change in British control. The British would change their policy in several ways. One, they would end salutary neglect. So whereas up to this point, the British had been largely uninvolved in the colonies and hadn't really gotten involved in, basically as long as they were making money, they were happy. And you're going to see the British change this. And one of the big reasons that they're going to change this policy is because they needed to make more money off of the colonists because of the massive debt that they would have as a result of the French and Indian War. Also, you're going to see the British military is left here, and a lot of colonists are not going to like this. They're going to resent the fact that the British military is left here. They felt like that they didn't need to be here, that the colonists could defend themselves, but the British military would be left here to help protect them. And as I had alluded to, they would increase the taxes on the colonies during this time. So with the French and Indian War, right after the French and Indian War, you're going to see because of the British winning the war, that is going to cause panic among the Indian groups because the Indians would be very, very worried that now that the French had lost territory, that basically there was going to be this huge swell of settlers coming into these new territories. And that's going to lead directly to Pontiac's rebellion. The Ottawa Chief Pontiac, the one who leads this, so you can see the quote there. He says, "I am French and I want to die French." And you're going to have other Indian leaders during this time, like Nealon, who says, hey, our suffering is caused by our dependence on Europeans. So that is going to lead to Pontiac's rebellion, which you can see the map there. And you're going to see that Pontiac rebellion would actually go really, really well for the Indians at first. If you see on that map there that shows all of the British forts that the Indians were able to take during this time. And on the next slide, I show you actually the story of Fort Michilimackinac, which if you look at the map there, it's in the very, very top part of Michigan there. And I'm not going to go through the story now, but the video tells you the story of how that fort would actually be conquered by the Indians, which is very, very interesting. But yeah, the Indians at first would do very, very well in Pontiac's war and in this rebellion as it is known. So what is going to be the results of this? Like I said, even though at the beginning of it, the Indians would take almost every British garrison west of Fort Niagara, including they would lay siege to Detroit and later Michigan. Eventually, though, they would be overwhelmed by the British. They would work to negotiate to end the rebellion. So once the British started winning, basically both sides came to the table and said, hey, let's figure this out, and they do. You would see that the Indian alliance would weaken and be defeated as tribes slowly started negotiating to end this, and the British used their troops. Another result is that the British would use their own troops instead of colonial militias to put down the rebellion, and the reason that this could cause issues is because, again, the colonists felt like they could defend themselves, and when they were not allowed to defend themselves in this, again, that's going to cause more resentment. You'll see there in those pictures that actually shows these are British drawings of actually British and / colonial children being returned by the native troops to them that they had been kidnapped during the war. So, as a result of the French and Indian War and then Pontiac's Rebellion, you're going to see that the British try to figure out what can we do to reduce the issues that we are having with the natives. And one of the things that they do is, hey, if we create a way to keep colonists from going over into Indian territory and we promise Indians like, hey, this land is reserved for you, that will reduce issues with the Indians, which will save the British Empire money. So the British create the Proclamation Line of 1763. And if you look at this map here, you can see the line that goes up and down all the way through the colonies. It's about almost halfway point of Virginia on this map. And what this proclamation did is it prohibited whites from settling west of the Appalachian. And again, the hope was that would stop the Indian conflicts that they were having. Another thing that this line also did is if there were already colonists living west of the line, they were forced to move back to the east of the line. So you can see how that would cause a lot of issues as well. So needless to say, colonists were not very happy about this. They felt like part of the reason for the French and Indian War was so that they could get involved and so that they could get these lands west of the Appalachians, and now that's being taken away from them. Here's another map showing you again what that proclamation line looked like. As you can see there, as far as our area is, it's west of Fincastle, which is basically right over the mountains from here. But you can see that. You can also see the British military forts that were still out there as well during this time. So this is going to lead to unrest and rebellion in the colonies. I found it most interesting, the Paxton Boys massacre, or the Paxton Boys rebellion that would happen. Basically, the Paxton Boys were located in western Pennsylvania, and they get upset feeling like the Pennsylvania government is not doing enough to help protect them from the Indians. So you have this on top of people being upset about the Pontiac Rebellion, colonists being upset about that happened. So group of Scots-Irish, the Paxton Boys, they decide to confront the Indians over attacks that have been happening on their farms in Pennsylvania. If you remember, Pennsylvania was run by the Quakers. The Quakers are pacifists. They were not willing to attack the Indians or anything like that. So the Paxton Boys would go in and they would massacre 20 members of the Conestoga tribe during that time. After massacring them, they decided that they were going to march on Philadelphia and take their grievances directly to the government there. If it came to violence, I think they were willing to do that. And something remarkable, they'd actually be met on the road to Philadelphia by Benjamin Franklin, and Benjamin Franklin would be able to arrange a truce and basically be able to figure out the issue and give them some assurances that they would be protected better by the Pennsylvania government there. In the next slide here, I'm giving you an account of the Paxton Boys massacre. I encourage you to read that. Really what they did to the Indians was quite a disgrace, and they were never punished for what happened to the Indians there. Once Benjamin Franklin's able to negotiate a truce with them, basically they all go back home, and the horrible stuff you'll read here happened to the Indians. There was no justice for that happening to them. Another thing that you're going to have happen is the regulator movement, which would happen in North and South Carolina. You can read the details of the regulator movement, but basically know that you're going to have more people in the western part of the colonies who get upset, feeling like that they are not being protected and that their interests are not being represented in the eastern governments in the colonies. And again, a lot of this is anger towards the colonial officials and how things were going. And you're going to see that would come to violence. North Carolina, you'd had fighting, 30 people died, 7 regulators would be executed. You'd also have violence in South Carolina as well. So as a result of the French and Indian War, and then again, these proclamation line, that is going to lead to a lot of unrest, especially in the western part of your colonies. So the impact of these colonial uprisings, you're going to see that these conflicts are also often intertwined with politics. And a lot of times that it's going to cause a lot of anger towards the British, and it's going to lead to growing resentment and a growing resistance to the British and their policies. And we're going to see that as the years build, as we get closer to the American Revolution, and as the British become more heavy-handed, that's going to lead to even more resistance. Now, you'll see these uprisings. You kind of can compare them to Bacon's Rebellion, because if you remember, Bacon's Rebellion involved Western Virginians who were very upset and felt like their interests weren't being represented by the Eastern government during that time. Now, the difference is that Bacon's rebellion was more of a focus on the colonial government. And you're going to see that Paxton Boys, the regulators, all that is kind of intertwined with being upset with the colonial government and, in its extension, the British governments during that time. So that's the end of this presentation talking about the 7 Years' War. Again, this war has a huge, huge impact. And really, you can say this is the defining event that would lead to the American Revolution, because this is when you really start to see the relationship between the British and the colonies really starting to fall apart in a very, very big way, as you've seen, for a multitude of different reasons. So I hope you all have a great day. Make sure you take care of doing the activities there, and make sure you read that article and anything else that is assigned for you. Have a great day.